5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
Hi everyone, this is Mr. Driscoll, and welcome to our Cold War era screencast. Okay, a quick overview. We're going to start with our essential question, then move into our themes in world history, then a balance of power of post-World War II Europe, take a look at how things played out there, then the confrontation of the superpowers. Okay, the two superpowers involved in the Cold War, of course, were the United States and Soviet Union. We'll take a look at that. And then we'll finish with discussing how the Cold War spread to really most countries in the world. Okay, the essential question for today is, what differences were there between the Soviet Union and the United States that led to the conflict that we know of today as the Cold War? Okay, this is a huge topic. Okay, people study this and take entire courses just on the Vietnam War, for instance. But let's just take this as an overview. What is some of the context needed to study this? And it really comes down to the conflict between these two countries ideologically. I felt that we can't really move on until we know the main difference between the two types of economies, because that was in some way at the heart of this difference. Okay, the United States had what's called a market economy or capitalist economy. In this economy, people or individuals own property, they own the means of production, they own businesses. The U.S. has some rules in our capitalist system, but for the most part it's individuals that drive it. Okay, there's not as much government intervention, and supply and demand determine the price and quantity of certain goods and services. On the other hand, command economies or communist economies have government control of property, of economic decision makings. They plan out what happens, who gets what, how much things cost, how much you get. Now, we don't have much time to go through the philosophies of each and the positives and negatives, but in a sense, that was the main difference between the two. Capitalist free market economy versus a command economy or communism. Okay, so the theme in world history that we've talked about throughout the years, competition amongst countries, a lot of times for resources, but also for political and military power. Okay, in this screencast, we'll take a look at how the Cold War was a competition not just between the United States and Soviet Union, but also other countries that were dragged into the conflict as well. Take a look at that picture to the right. Okay, they're arm wrestling. What are they sitting on? Okay, what does it look like the man to the right is about to press? Okay, we'll come back to this a little bit later in the screencast. Okay, so the confrontation between the two superpowers, that's the first main idea. Okay, after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became fierce rivals with each other. Okay, in 1949, the United States and its European allies formed NATO, okay, the North American Treaty Organization. The U.S. wanted the newly freed countries of Eastern Europe to hold free elections, hoping that they would establish democratic governments such as ours. Okay, in 1955, the Soviet Union responded by creating their own alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. We'll take a closer look at that a little bit later. Okay, the Soviet Union opposed the West's plans, fearing that they would become anti-communist, and they kept their forces. The Soviet Union kept their forces in these newly liberated countries in Eastern Europe. So President Truman responded. He issued what's called today is the Truman Doctrine, tried to persuade Greece, Turkey, and other nations threatened by communist expansion to choose democratic forms of government. Basically, anyone that we thought was under communist threat, we would come to their aid as a matter of national interest. Okay, Dean Acheson explained, he was U.S. Secretary of State, that corruption in Greece, okay, would likely spread to nearby countries, okay, which kind of precedes what we would later call the domino theory. So the Marshall Plan was created. That gave $13 billion to countries in Europe to rebuild. Now, why did we do this? Well, one of the main motives was to try to get allies in this new Cold War era. Okay, Soviet Union understood what was going on. They created satellite states of influence, but also refused to participate in this Marshall Plan. They just saw this as a bribe. The United States was bribing some countries in Europe to become allies with them in this new confrontation. Okay, the U.S. adopted a formal policy of containment. Basically, how do we keep Soviet aggression or Soviet expansion from happening? Okay, Berlin was one hotbed of this early confrontation. After World War II, it was actually split up into 4 different zones. One of them by the United States, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Okay, the western part was the United States, Great Britain, and France. Eastern part was ruled by the Soviet Union. Now, word got out that West Germany was going to create its own separate state or country. The Soviet Union did not like that. So they set up a blockade. What a blockade means is they cut off all air transportation, ground transportation, water transportation, anything that going to Berlin. Now, Berlin was split up the same way. Berlin had those 4 different zones. They didn't let any supplies get in from the West. In response to that, the United States and the other allies sent in what's called the airlift, the Berlin airlift. They just sent tons of supplies. For 10 months, they sent 200,000 flights with over 2.3 million tons of supplies to West Berlin. Now, the Soviet Union finally drew back, and in response to that, what they ended up doing was creating their own Eastern Germany. So, in 1949, once the blockade ended, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed. That created West Germany. Okay, the German Democratic Republic, which is kind of a misnomer, it wasn't democratic at all, but that was set up in East Germany by the Soviets. Okay, how did the Cold War spread? Take a look at that map at the bottom. We can see that it wasn't just the United States and the Soviet Union. This really affected all parts of the world. And we'll see how by 1980, all those countries that have either red or blue shading or those dots on were countries that were in some way involved with this. Even some that aren't shaded there were definitely involved. So for instance, like China, it's hard to convince me that they had nothing to do with any of this. So anyway, we'll take a closer look now at how this spread throughout the world. Okay, first, when China fell to communism under Mao Zedong, they became, a huge power. Okay, and it also spooked a lot of people in the West saying, look, communism is spreading. Okay, on top of that, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. Okay, so now they have nuclear weapons. And this is what started what we know of today as the arms race. Okay, both sides began stockpiling as much weapons as they possibly could. Okay, that silly cartoon on the right portrays that. Okay, deterrence was this idea that if both sides created these huge stockpiles of nuclear weapons, it would keep the other side from attacking. Okay, they wouldn't strike back because they know if a nuclear war broke out, both countries would be completely destroyed. So they also started to create alliances with other countries throughout the world. Okay, so not only did they have this huge stockpile of weapons, but each side tried to create as many alliances as possible. Okay, I'm just going to quickly go through some of the different alliances. The first 2 we briefly discussed. I'm not going to talk about every single country here. It'll be listed. If you need to reference them, you can go back to the screencast, or you could just simply look it up online. They should all be there. Okay, so NATO is the first, formed in 1949. Okay, you mentioned that earlier. That included countries such as the United States, France, and Britain. Okay, in response to that was the Warsaw Pact. That was when the Soviet Union created their own form of NATO. That was in 1955 and included these following Eastern European countries. Okay, then so the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization was created in 1954. That was to prevent Soviet aggression in the East. That included the United States, Great Britain, and those other Asian countries. And then the Central Treaty Organization, that was created to keep the Soviet Union from expanding into the South. Okay, and these are some of the countries included in that particular alliance. When it was all said and done, the United States was involved with over 40 military alliances throughout the world. Okay, these were alliances of trade, but most importantly, military pacts and agreements with each other. Okay, going back to Berlin, what happened was East Berlin's living conditions were much worse off than West. Okay, so a lot of them started escaping through West Berlin and flying out and escaping to the West. So then leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, he ordered that a wall be built, the Berlin Wall, to divide the city into 2. And we can see in that image there them constructing the wall. Okay, actually, to go back to that, what this wall, it wasn't just a wall. This was a symbol of the stark divide between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the United States and all of its allies. Okay, so don't think of the Berlin Wall just as a wall that's put in the city. It was really a symbol between the 2 different ideologies and these competing sides in the Cold War. Okay, this brings us to Fidel Castro's rise in Cuba. Okay, he set up a Soviet-supported socialist regime there. So basically, they created an alliance that was a threat to the United States. Okay, JFK understood this, and he authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which was a disaster. Okay, it just didn't work. It didn't create the uprising we wanted. If anything, it only escalated the situation. So, this leads us to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Okay, the U.S. blockaded a fleet of Soviet ships carrying nuclear missiles to Cuba. Okay, this was not an easy decision, though. A lot of people in his administration were saying, go to war. Okay, you need to invade Cuba to keep them from getting these nuclear weapons. Okay, there's a lot more to this. We can go through it all in class, or you can research some of this as part of the unit. Long story short, he decided on a blockade instead, the more diplomatic measure. It worked. Okay, the Soviets turned back, and the United States agreed not to invade Cuba. Okay, the next part of this was the Vietnam War. Okay, the United States became involved in this really as part of this domino theory, or this idea that if the communist North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, then communism would spread throughout the region. Again, this is a very involved topic. We'll have more time to discuss in class, but in the end, the United States' efforts failed. Okay, North Vietnam ended up winning, but even after that, the domino theory never really came to fruition. It never happened. Communism didn't spread throughout the region at the time. We found out that relations between China and Russia were a lot worse than we originally thought. Again, long story short, the U.S. withdrew. It showed that U.S. couldn't just impose its will everywhere and have success everywhere. It was really a blow to U.S. morale. But also, it made a new step in American-Soviet relations, leading into eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union, which we'll discuss a little bit later in the course. Okay, I know that was a rapid-fire overview of a lot of different things, but hopefully it provided some context about the issue, the basic ideas and historical developments that happened. And we'll have some fun this unit looking into some of these different events: Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin airlift, the Vietnam War. Okay, a lot of stuff to talk about. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in class.